Value Impulses with DR, Ulrich Vogel, Personnel Diagnostics, Insights, Leadership Assessments, and Personnel Development.
A very warm and sincere welcome, dear listener, to our brand new series that is truly exclusive and highly specialized in the field of leadership within hospitals. And for that, I have Steffen Köhler with me, who is the head of Department for HR and Education at the Southeast Bavaria Clinics. And we've been working together for quite a number of years now on a wide range of topics. The podcast was one where we said, now we really need to dig a bit deeper. We need to take a look at how we can approach leadership, and that's what we called it, in 7 steps, not just rushing through and barely touching on the topics, but really going in depth in some areas. I'm really glad you're here again today, Steffen.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here too. Hello, dear Uli, and let's get started. No time to waste. I think the listeners are excited after the first 2 episodes as well. Rock and roll.
Yes, let's go. So, the first 2 episodes, the first one was about core values in leadership. The second episode, we talked about the playbook, meaning getting the right people in the right roles, and today we're tackling a topic that's not exactly easy. Let me give you a little teaser. Leadership is always about relationships too. Emotions are part of it as well, even if, as we said in the pre-talk, it's not everyone's cup of tea and so on. But folks, this is really important. According to Hartman, we have 3 main value dimensions: the human, the practical, and the systemic. And to this day, as I see it, the working world is still dominated by the functional practical and the systemic, while the human aspect is always present. But that's actually the untapped resource, as they say. So that's really the reservoir where we can make sure that people are passionate, that people want to do things from within themselves and not just because it's somehow required. And that's why maybe a headline like "Leadership Through Emotional Intelligence and Empathy" is so important for team cohesion. But above all, since we're in a hospital, it can promote patient satisfaction. So how can emotions and interpersonal relationships be used effectively as leadership skills? And that's not something to be ashamed of. Emotions are necessary, they're part of it, and I'd like to dig a bit deeper into that, to explain leadership as a relationship and also connect it to the hospital setting. There's always this buzzword, lean hospital strategy or strategy. Steffen, would you mind giving a quick introduction, just a few words, so our audience can get a sense of what this is about?
Yes, for us, the topic of lean is always crucial and really should always be part of things, especially nowadays. That's our North Star. We orient ourselves by that, and as you rightly introduced, the patient is our focus. That's why we exist. It's about being able to guide and care for the patient well. That's what we're passionate about. That's why our people are here. And I'm absolutely certain that there's a lot of emotion and empathy involved, which we need and which you can really see if you get the chance to watch our staff at work in the hospital. So, your introduction was spot on. It's essential. Whether it's in the outward or inward perception of each staff member, this topic is always relevant. So, the heart really is a strong component, even when it comes to profiling.
Absolutely. And when I look at it, you basically have, as your business purpose or organizational purpose, exactly that focus on the patient. I've been in hospital a few times in my life, thankfully not too often, but that's when things get serious. When you come in as a person, emotions are fully involved, and it's a real challenge to bring that into a hospital's leadership structure in an appropriate way. I think it's worth talking about this a bit, about emotional intelligence, empathy, and especially trust, how people interact with each other, and the emotional side of things. Yes, you could also see it as management, meaning that we don't just deal with feelings as they come, but rather accept them as something important. And maybe just a quick example, an anecdote from my consulting practice. Years ago, I once advised a startup team where the goal was to realign things at the C-level, and that was pretty tough. By the way, it was also in the health sector at the time. And at some point, when the knot finally came undone, it was actually because the CEO, quite spontaneously, said, "Wow, I'm really happy about your success." And it was about the COO at that point, because she had managed to break through a bottleneck in production, and he expressed, "Hey, I'm so happy for you." So, simply sharing emotionally that you have this feeling yourself and that you can be happy for someone else, that really triggered something in the team. And let's dive in. We always have a basic structure we follow. That's what we set out to do with the 7 steps, with the 7 episodes, that in part A, we always cover the what, so what is this actually about for us? Then in part B, the how. And then we also take a look at leadership practice. How can we apply it? Let's get into it. Here's the what's this about? So, it's about emotions and relationships in leadership, and why are emotions and relationships so important in leadership? And I think trust is something absolutely essential here. And I'll ask you something specific in a moment, but first I just want to quickly say something about trust, because it's really underestimated. So, trust, it's really about having faith, and we actually use it every day. And just imagine, Steffen, you too, dear listeners, what if, all of a sudden, there was no trust anymore? None at all. Not in society, not in the business world. Let's take a look at the business world. There wouldn't be any transactions anymore, nothing at all would happen. So, trust is the crucial lubricant that makes anything work in the first place. And that means, conversely, if trust isn't really well developed, then we're always dealing with friction, always with brakes holding things back. And now, here's a question for you, Steffen, just to get us started. Trust, how do you perceive it in the company, and what's your opinion? If we look at it, what role does it play in our topic of relationships, leadership, and also when it comes to emotions? What are your immediate thoughts?
For us, trust is one of the key points and also one of our values because we obviously have to trust each other. I mean, I'm not an expert when it comes to the medical field, but I do observe it, and of course I also hope that colleagues trust each other. For example, every chief physician is ultimately responsible for what happens there, and from the very beginning, they have to learn to trust their senior doctors, who in turn need to trust the junior doctors to a certain extent. That's why they're not given a long introduction or extensive training. You look to see if you can trust them, to what extent that trust grows, and I can also imagine that it becomes a big issue when something does happen, when your trust is put to the test and then has to be regained. It might sound a bit wild now, but that's just how it is. Of course, it's very much about health, about the well-being of the patients, and ultimately there are also legal questions involved. So in that sense, trust is certainly of great value, and you have to live it, you have to experience it. I think you can already feel that in the hospital, it really guides things there. So when you watch the colleagues interacting, how they treat each other, how well they work together in good teams, and how there are these routines that just happen naturally, I have to admit, as someone working in administration, I'm sometimes a bit jealous because I can really see, wow, things are running smoothly there. They're following a standard with a strong focus on the patient and a lot of empathy, which, by the way, is our next topic, and I really do notice that. You can really tell that this is a very essential core of our work.
And that's exactly where high performance comes in, which you're also talking about. I mean, back when I started my own business and took on management roles in a GmbH, I learned that you're basically always standing with one leg in jail, so to speak, always on the side of the law and all that. But if I look at a chief physician or even the individual staff members, excuse the harsh wording, but they're standing with one foot in the grave, meaning the grave for the patient. That means it's so extremely critical that you really have to say, just like in aviation, it's the same in medicine. And in that situation, the trust between each other, when things are happening in an operating room like that, is extremely important. I know this from aviation. I once heard a great talk by the head of safety at Lufthansa, who's a pilot himself, and he said, if I walk into the cockpit and there's no more laughter, then it gets dangerous. So, if we project that onto our situation, we really have to pay attention and recognize that emotions and relationships between people are obviously, I'd say, at least as important as the professional skills you have in order to be effective as a leader, as a chief physician, as a manager in a hospital. Let's get right into the how. So, how do I use empathy and emotional intelligence in leadership? So how can I, as a leader, actively use my emotional intelligence in everyday life, especially in a hospital setting? I mean, we all know Carl Rogers and his work on active listening and so on, how he developed ways of having conversations so that employees feel understood and seen. Do you maybe have an example from the hospital where you'd say, yes, active listening could really be illustrated there?
There are definitely plenty of very active examples where you can really make this clear. Maybe more from administration, from my own direct environment, where I regularly notice when employees come to me and need some advice, that it's important not to just talk over them and say, yeah, I have the solution right away, but instead to let them speak first. For example, using the technique of who asks, leads, just as one method. By asking smart questions, you try to help them find the right direction themselves, because that way they come out of it feeling empowered. And I actually use this quite often because I've had good experiences with it. And for that, you really have to listen carefully and try to look beyond what's being said, to read between the lines. Yes, that does happen, especially when colleagues need some advice from me, which comes up from time to time.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I see. And my topic is feedback, giving feedback, receiving feedback. I mean, that's the case in every company. But in a hospital, it can sometimes be a bit more unique, because imagine if a doctor has to give feedback to a new resident after a difficult surgery. Well, I think that's a bit, how should I put it, a bit more challenging than if I were to do that in a regular company, because we also have this critical patient perspective involved. So, I am wondering, how exactly can I go about giving calm, respectful feedback about specific areas where there is room for improvement? And still, let's say, deliver it in a way that genuinely boosts their professional confidence and morale, so that the young resident doesn't start doubting their own abilities or their potential, just because maybe they didn't do every single thing perfectly. I really notice, especially in the hospital, when we're in these surgical units, that we have to keep in mind just how challenging it is, and I'm not sure if people on the outside, those working in regular companies, always appreciate that enough. That's why I want to put in a good word here for your surgical staff. I don't know if you ever hear anything about this from within the organization, or if you talk about these kinds of cases and issues as well. How does it come across to you when I just say it off the cuff like that?
No, that's exactly how it is, and that's how it should be. And I'd actually like to maybe switch sides a bit here and talk about something smaller, like when we're working in nursing. It's not just the big surgeries, of course, those are important, but when it comes to, say, preparing medication, and maybe a young staff member is tired after a long night shift and has to get something ready, you really have to focus. On the one hand, you need trust, which we just talked about, but the value we emphasize, what we call reliability, is just as important. The person has to do it in a way that everyone can count on. You could say, accountable, they're the one responsible in that moment, and there's no one else there to double-check whether it's 0.4 cl or milliliters or whatever is needed, or if, because they're tired, they end up putting 4.0 into the syringe. But of course, that can have disastrous consequences if something goes wrong. And that's why I say, we have to learn this very, very early on the one hand, to work precisely, and on the other, to be able to trust that the person you're working with understands this too, knows it as well, otherwise the whole operation just doesn't work. And that's simply different than if you're working with some kind of work piece. Of course, that's not supposed to break either, and you're not really supposed to make mistakes there, but still, if you cut a bolt wrong, you just toss it aside and grab a new one if your colleague in quality control notices. With us, though, something can go seriously wrong, and you might have to turn a routine administration of medication into an emergency rescue operation very quickly. I'm not sure if you understand what I'm trying to say. Of course, I have a lot of respect for high-performance medicine and everything doctors do, but I believe it really starts with everyone who interacts with the patient, and the patient relies on that. And as we said earlier, the patient is at the center, and that's what it's all about. So, at any given moment, you have to be able to deliver top performance as well. Here we are again, like in episode 2. It's simply my job. I have to be able to set everything else aside and block it out, and be fully focused, I have to admit. Sometimes I use this example when I'm talking about the quality of our work in my HR department. Of course, mistakes can happen, but ideally, we should work in a way that I'm highly focused on everything I do, keeping my attention on it. And I think, do it right the first time. That's what we say in Lean, then we also avoid waste. For us, it's more about avoiding waste. Of course, it's a pain when the wrong certificate gets sent out, but it can usually be fixed, which makes a difference. Still, it's annoying. So, in that sense, I think the difference has become clear, but it still applies to all employees. We just want to be a reliable partner, no matter where we're working in the value creation process.
What comes to mind for me here is a certain approachability, which I think comes from the leadership. Let's take the example of a manager and a nurse. Something I learned from one of my very good trainers in management consulting is that, as a leader, I don't just have to be able to convince people rationally so that they know what they're doing and why they're doing it, and so on. But ideally, I actually have to make sure that they love doing it, and even better, that they love doing it for me, or rather, to emotionally involve myself in what I'm saying. And since our topic is feelings and leadership relationships, it's just not enough to convey rationality to people. Of course, it's logical and important. You have to do everything, understand why things are the way they are, and be precise about this and that. But it's also about creating a spirit that ensures I'm not mentally half-absent or anything like that. It's because I feel that my leader is there, the team is there, there's the spirit, there are these feelings, and then I actually love doing what I do, which helps me do it better than if I were just doing it rationally. And I truly believe that, together with the example you just provided, it provides a much clearer explanation of how emotion can actually exert a significantly more powerful influence than pure reason alone. Of course, we absolutely need both of these elements, but it clearly demonstrates that we also have to dedicate our resources and attention to this specific field. Let's take a look at the practical implementation when we consider emotional leadership in everyday clinical practice. I can really picture that, for example, as you mentioned earlier, when an employee is emotionally exhausted, and as a leader, being there for them and making it possible for them to safely return to the team. So that's one aspect. Or if we look at team building trust, how do I, as a leader, make sure the team feels safe so that people can openly share their ideas and fears? The key term here is psychological safety. I think there are also examples of how, in a hospital setting, you really have to pay close attention to this. So I do think we can have a focused discussion here about how, as a leader, I can intentionally provide emotional support without wanting to dominate or exert too much control. And if you carefully examine the hospital once again, where exactly is that specific moment or location where I, acting as a leader, can offer and deliver targeted emotional support to those in need? What are some situations that come to mind for you where you think, yes, exactly there, if you learn to give emotional support, everything gets better? Maybe you can think of one or two examples from your area.
Yes, of course. For us, it's very often about being there, as HR, to listen first, to take things in, and to put them into perspective. That's our role, to assess what exactly is needed. And we're a strategic team. We think about how we can help on site, how we can bring the right support to the location, whether it's supervision that an entire team needs or peer support that an individual requires. And we've successfully developed and implemented a comprehensive method with an external provider, where our doctors are extensively trained to become certified peer supporters, so they can offer high-quality professional and empathetic peer-level support to their colleagues. When a doctor, let's say, comes out of the or another department and, for example, a patient has passed away, and that's a fate or something that happens often. There's usually no one in their family circle who is able to help or even understand what they're going through. And that's exactly where it makes sense for us to offer some support. And I don't think HR should necessarily be the first point of contact in that situation either. That's why we support with specialists in those cases. That's our role, and we often notice that we can help with operational issues, like when stress comes up again around working hours or leadership questions, or how people interact with each other. A doctor or a nurse isn't consistently doing what they're supposed to, for example. In those situations, we're definitely a sparring partner, and we can also just listen. We're often the first ones who have to deliver a message, maybe about poor performance or something like that, because things might not have gone so well beforehand. But honestly, that's why we have a good leadership development program. So these days, not as much of that comes to us anymore. We can usually handle that pretty well through the local leadership. I'm a bit proud of that, because that really has to be the goal, that the leaders are able to handle things themselves. We've already put a huge number of leaders, especially in nursing, through a basic leadership training program, and it's making a difference. So our colleagues are well prepared, they know where to get help, and they're already pretty good at challenging and supporting each other.
We should probably clarify the scope here for the listeners as well. We're talking about nearly 4,000 people you have there, spread across different locations and clinics. And of course, you have to approach the whole thing strategically. And you, as the head of the department here, as the head of the business unit, are at the point where you obviously have to say, I need to make sure the systems work, that help is provided on site, and also, and this is the topic of our current episode, that leadership with a focus on relationships can develop there. So, as you said, through experts who might come in, through initiatives, through leadership development, so that these systems can be lived, or, in our sense, felt there. That's actually our next topic for the upcoming episode, where we'll really be thinking about leadership systems in hospitals. But I think it's a really nice connection if we mention it here already. I'd like to wrap things up for this episode. What's the takeaway if we want to sum it all up? Leadership as a relationship isn't just about professional competence, but above all about empathy, emotional intelligence, and trust as the foundation, which, as we discussed earlier, is really key. Empathy is, of course, the key. If we can manage to bring that to the strategic level and then implement it operationally so that leaders act with empathy, things just work differently. Communication really gets going, and you get real team dynamics. In the end, you're also measuring things by patient satisfaction. So, my dear and valued listener, whether you happen to work in a busy healthcare facility or hospital setting, or perhaps in a completely different field altogether, I want you to take a moment to think deeply about what meaningful and actionable concrete steps you can personally take to significantly increase empathy, emotional intelligence, mutual respect, and trust within your own unique professional environment. And in doing so, you will effectively boost the overall well-being, health, and long-term performance of your entire team. Because feelings aren't just some fluffy add-on or something extra, they're actually a powerful tool, a vehicle to achieve your goals. And at the end of the day, we're all people who want to accomplish something together, for patients and staff, in this case. And it's not about keeping the system going just for the sake of the system. So, Steffen, I was really glad that in this episode, where it's truly about feelings, we could dive in on one hand, but also look at it from a meta level on the other. And yeah, I think your interjections, comments, and observations really added substance to it with your examples. So thank you so much for having this conversation with me. And I think we're already starting to get ourselves warmed up for the next episode, where we'll transition away from the focus on relationships and feelings in leadership to looking at the broader organizational systems at play. A big thank you, Steffen, for being here today.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and have a great day, everyone.
Thanks. Wonderful. See you then. Bye.